America's Cold War, Chapter 5, The Nuclear Rubicon, Part 2. The Second Quemoy-Matsu Crisis. The first of the four crises occurred in 1958, when those now familiar minuscule islands in the Taiwan Straits, Matsu and the chain known as Quemoy, returned to international attention. Little by little, during the first months of the year, Mao Zedong's People's Republic of China began to denounce the continued possession of Quemoy-Matsu by the American lackeys in Taiwan. 4 years had passed since the first crisis in the Straits, and Beijing leaders were frustrated by the continued intransigence of Chiang Kai-shek's government, and by its efforts followed the earlier crisis to bolster his military presence on the islands. With the United States having signed a mutual defense treaty with Chiang's government, Mao also sought to determine Washington's real intentions toward the island, and in addition, he hoped to use a renewed confrontation to drum up revolutionary zeal among Chinese as part of his emerging Great Leap Forward domestic campaign. Accordingly, Beijing again demanded that the small islands, much closer to the mainland than to Taiwan, be returned to Chinese control. The possession of the island chain by Taiwan did not make great geopolitical sense, but Chiang had made a point of seizing them as a means of defying the communist regime, and both Truman and Eisenhower, wary of antagonizing the Taipei's regime's fervent supporters on Capitol Hill, had long pledged to support him. Mao's ultimate intentions were unclear to Washington, but if he attempted to take the islands by force, the National Security Council had a contingency plan to stop him. According to NSC Planning, document number 5723, it would be impossible to defend Quemoy-Matsu against a large Chinese invasion with conventional forces. The U.S. 7th Fleet would move to guard the island chain, but as Gerard Smith, director of the policy planning staff, reported in a follow-up memo, current war plans envisioned responding to a major Chinese attack with nuclear strikes deep into communist China, resulting in millions of non-combatant casualties. This in turn would likely bring a major Soviet retaliation in defense of its ally, in the form of nuclear strikes against Taiwan and the U.S. 7th Fleet. Under our present strategic concept, Smith wrote, this would be the signal for general nuclear war between the U.S. and the USSR. Just like that, Eisenhower's new nuclear policies were being put to the test. If the Chinese invaded the tiny islands, barely more than rocks jutting out of the South China Sea, America's official policy was to respond with a nuclear attack that, according to U.S. estimates, would initiate global thermonuclear war. Behind the scenes, Eisenhower had devised his policies so that, in the event of a serious Cold War showdown, he would have to push matters toward compromise and away from military conflict. Quemoy-Matsu, with the United States defended largely for domestic political purposes, was an unexpected venue for the first implementation of his strategy, but he now had no choice but to follow through. On August 23rd, China began shelling the sparsely populated islands with artillery. No one could know whether these attacks foreshadowed a general invasion, but Chiang Kai-shek begged the White House to back his armies in a campaign to retake the mainland. Senior American military officials, both on the scene and in Washington, likewise demanded a military response, preferably with nuclear weapons. Eisenhower refused, stating publicly that the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan, not the islands alone, and denying requests for military action. To cover that again, because it was a bit messy. Eisenhower refused, stating publicly that the United States would come to the defense of Taiwan, not the islands alone, and denying requests for military action. Dulles had spent months strenuously objecting to Eisenhower's nuclear policies, going so far as to dissent from his precedent in the pages of Foreign Affairs. He believed that the United States should prepare to fight limited nuclear war, not because he sought such a war, but because he was convinced that Ike's all-or-nothing policy would demoralize American allies and give the initiative to a ravenous and ruthless USSR. In this case, however, he agreed with Eisenhower's decision. Getting into a war over Quemoy Matsu made no sense to him. Even if the fighting did not escalate into general thermonuclear war, the use of atomic weapons would terrify American allies in the Cold War theater that mattered much more in his eyes: Europe. There was no alternative but to cut a deal with the Chinese. On September 4th, following secret conversations with Eisenhower, the Secretary of State communicated to the British ambassador that the United States might be amenable to a plan to demilitarize the islands, as long as Beijing recognized them as nationalist possessions. That's Taiwan possessions. Unlike America, Great Britain had normal diplomatic relations with Beijing and could make sure the message got through. The Chinese were responsive. On September 6, Premier and Foreign Minister Zhou Enlai announced his government's willingness to commence talks with the United States. 2 weeks of haggling ensued, whereupon delegates from the United States, China, and Taiwan met in Warsaw to work out an arrangement. Over the rest of September, while the diplomats negotiated, China maintained its daily bombing campaign. On October 6th, the Communist government and Taipei announced a ceasefire. Even though Quemoy Matsu had not been demilitarized, as new documentation shows, this was probably due to Soviet pressure on Beijing not to escalate the conflict as long as Taiwan and the United States held their fire. In one of the many geopolitical curiosities of the Cold War, China indicated that it would respect the demands of its Soviet ally, but only halfway. In late October, the communist regime recommenced its artillery bombardment on every other day. By that time, however, the United States had long since extricated itself from the conflict. The Chinese governments on either side of the Taiwan Straits would have to learn to live with the bizarre, unresolved situation. Beijing's alternate day bombings of the island continued until the 1970s, and Quemoy artisans made a profitable business by forging iron implements from the spent Chinese shells. The Eisenhower administration's behavior during the second Quemoy Matsu crisis alarmed the British, who wondered whether the White House had actually been willing to risk global war over two islands the size of postage stamps in the South China Sea. Foreign Ministers Selwyn Lloyd traveled to Washington in the middle of September and listened in horror as Dulles calmly told him that the United States had indeed been ready to use nuclear weapons in the crisis. Lloyd then discussed the matter with Eisenhower himself. The British, Lloyd stated, were terrified at the thought that the Americans might start a war over such small stakes. The president reassured him. If the United States were to use nuclear weapons, he said, it would be an all-out effort rather than a local effort. And he had no plans, Eisenhower continued, to use nuclear weapons in any local situation at the present time. The foreign minister left the Oval Office in a better mood. End of part 2.